Hey everybody, it's nutritionist Amy Berger from 2itnutrition.com, back with you again for another episode of doing keto without the crazy. Rocking the flowered shirt today. I think this is only the second time I've ever put this on, and I've had this shirt forever. I've had it probably for at least 3 or 4 years. I think I need to start wearing it again. I kind of like it. Anyway, enough about me and my shirts, and on to today's topic, which is hypoglycemia. Kind of a big issue in the low carb and keto world, as it should be, right? So what is hypoglycemia? The word itself has the definition built right into it. Hypo, meaning too low or too little. Glyc or glyce is glucose. Emia means in the blood. So hypoglycemia means too little sugar, too little glucose in the blood. However, that's kind of a nebulous definition because who says what is too little? It's a very hard thing to define because some people can have a blood sugar in the 50s or 60s and feel totally fine. And someone else can have a blood sugar in the 80s or 90s and feel all those scary symptoms of hypoglycemia. So it's not just an individual thing, but it's an individual physiological state thing. And we'll talk about all this in detail. But before we do that, what are the signs and symptoms of hypoglycemia? Lots of different things. The short list, and this is not an exhaustive list, the short list includes sweating, feeling shaky, like shakiness, feeling dizzy, lightheaded, ravenous hunger, possibly having headaches. You may pass out, irritability, like personality changes. There's probably a few more that I'm missing. Those are the ones off the top of my head. So it's really not, hypoglycemia is not defined by your actual blood sugar level. It's defined by how you feel. Because remember, I just said you could have what would typically be considered a pretty low blood sugar, but you feel totally fine, and someone could have what would be considered a totally normal blood sugar, yet they have, raging signs of hypoglycemia. So it's not just the absolute value. Some people think so. It's the absolute value combined with what else is going on in the body, and especially in the brain and central nervous system. We'll get to that in a sec. But it's also believed, and I don't know if this has been proven as a fact yet or not, but a lot of people believe that in addition to just not being the absolute value of glucose in your blood, hypoglycemia may occur by the rate of the drop. Meaning, if your blood sugar was 150 and all of a sudden it's 85, and that happens within a very short time period, even though 85 would be considered a totally normal blood sugar, because it fell so quickly from having been higher, you will have those feelings of hypoglycemia. So there's a lot of different things going on. Some people, especially with type 2 diabetes, and especially on certain medications, if they have a blood sugar that any of us would consider totally fine, like between the 70s and 90s, and these are the US units. I apologize for those watching this from overseas. I don't know the calculation off the top of my head, but if someone like that has a blood sugar between the 70s and 90s, they might feel hypoglycemic because they're used to running at 250. They're used to running at 175. They're used to running at 300. Their body is so accustomed to having a blood sugar that's so much higher that when they have a blood sugar at 95 or 80, they feel hypoglycemic, even though that's totally not a low blood sugar. So there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of context to all this. So let's see. The feelings of hypoglycemia, that like rapid heart rate, shakiness, dizziness, irritability, all of that is the sympathetic nervous system being activated. When your blood sugar drops very low, or when it drops quickly from having been higher, it's like a crisis situation to your body. And so your body does things to raise the blood sugar, because it's not good for you to have truly, truly low blood sugar that you're going to pass out and die or be in a hypoglycemic coma situation. So your body, in order to help you survive, to keep you alive, like releases all these hormones, does all these things to raise your blood sugar, like releasing adrenaline, releasing cortisol, just flooding your body with glucose. So it's kind of funny that for me personally, this happened to me a long time ago, and I was actually on a low carb diet when this happened. So it's still, even when you're on keto, you can still have some of these incidents depending on what else is going on in your life. I've said this in other videos. Blood sugar and insulin are not regulated solely by our diet, by our food. That's the biggest influence on those things, but it's not the only one. So lots of different things factor into your blood sugar and insulin levels on any given day at any given point in time. The point is, a while back, and I don't test my blood sugar very often, but yeah, every now and then I check. And I was having that very clear presentation of hypoglycemia. Like, I was irritable, I was shaky, I was hungry, I was going to eat my own hand if I didn't find food in 2 seconds, all the classics. So I'm like, let me just test the old blood sugar and see what's going on. And you know what it was? I think it was like 88. It was a totally normal, non-low blood sugar. And all I can think is, and I don't remember what I was eating or what the situation was that day, that might have been one of those rapid plummet situations. Or my guess is that my blood sugar might have been very, very low. Like, I couldn't even speculate, 30s low, 40s low. But by the time I got around to checking it, even if it was only a couple of minutes, by the time I said, you know what, let me check and see what's going on. And I keep doing that because I'm like pricking my finger. I'm Jewish. I'm not Italian, but I guess Jews talk with their hands too. So by the time I checked it, it was in the 80s, and I think that maybe I was overtly low, but by the time I checked it, all of those mechanisms had kicked in and already restored it to a more normal level. And so I missed the moment when it was really low. But that total speculation, I don't know. All I'm saying is that I had that very clear hypoglycemic presentation with a totally normal blood sugar, or at least it was normal by the time I got to check it. Now, on the flip side of that, I checked my blood sugar once. I was feeling great, feeling awesome. Everything was cool. And I don't know, I guess I was just checking it because I just was curious. It was 56. That's the lowest I've ever seen my blood sugar. My blood sugar might have been lower at some other time, and I just didn't measure it. Like I said, I don't check very often, but this 56 is the lowest I've ever seen it. And I felt awesome. I felt great. And I didn't have a ketone meter at that time, but I can only assume that my ketone level was elevated and it was making up that fuel in the central nervous system and in the brain. Because here's the thing. What we consider hypoglycemia is a crisis on the part of the brain and the central nervous system. The brain is, oh, I don't have any fuel, I don't have any glucose, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, panic mode. That's what hypoglycemia is. It's the brain and central nervous systems sending out an SOS, a help signal to the body. Now, when you're on a ketogenic diet, when you have elevated ketones, this whole thing kind of shifts a bit, because when your brain is accustomed to running on glucose, when your brain is requiring a certain amount of glucose, it damn well better get that glucose. When your brain is more accustomed to being fueled, at least in part, by ketones, it doesn't need as much glucose, right? That's one of the beautiful things about ketogenic diets, especially for neurological conditions, for Alzheimer's disease, for cognitive impairment, for brain fog, for any of that. It's that we are sort of not taking glucose out of the equation entirely, but we're making glucose a lot less important. When you have elevated ketones, the brain doesn't need as much glucose because the ketones are serving as part of that fuel source. And so I think that's why we can have people on ketogenic diets with a blood sugar in the 40s or 50s and they feel great, and why we can have a type 2 diabetic or a non-diabetic with a blood sugar of 80 and they feel like garbage. They feel like they need to eat everything in sight because they don't have the ketones to make that up. They did some really fascinating studies, I think like in the 1950s and 60s, I'm not sure of the year though, Long before there were IRBs, the Institutional Review Board, long before you had to get a study protocol approved by an ethics committee, when you could just kind of do crazy stuff to people because there was no approval, they would have people fast for, I don't remember how long the fast was in this study, but so people were long fasted, so they had elevated ketones, and they injected these people with insulin. Can you imagine being fasted and now you're going to give me insulin? Whoa, talk about my blood sugar plummeting. And you know what? That's exactly what happened. These subjects, I think if I recall correctly, had blood glucose levels in the 30s. And again, I don't know the conversion unit to millimole or moles, but 30s is really darn low for blood sugar. And you know what? They felt fine. They had zero signs and symptoms of hypoglycemia because they had substantial ketones fueling the central nervous system, so there's no crisis situation whatsoever. You could never get that approved today, but thank goodness we have that data from all those years ago. Checking the notes so I don't forget anything. So that's really the difference between symptomatic hypoglycemia in somebody with normal blood sugar versus somebody with a crazy low blood sugar who feels totally fine. It's the presence or absence of the ketones, really. Let's see. I personally think, and I mentioned this in the video that I did on keto and mental health, I personally think a lot of what we consider anxiety attacks, panic attacks, and road rage is unstable blood sugar or unrecognized hypoglycemia. Wild fluctuations, but especially wild lows in blood sugar. And I've experienced this. I mean, we've all had that road rage. We've all had, even since going on a low carb or ketogenic diet, every now and then that still happens. I think there's many reasons why. Migraines are also a lot of people. My best friend when I was a kid had migraines, and looking back now, knowing what I know now, I see very clearly that it was hypoglycemia. She was kind of a sugar fiend, my best friend to this day, so like my dear best friend, maybe she's watching this. But that was very clear hypoglycemia, I think. I didn't know it in 1986, but I know now. So what is the concern here? What's the big deal? If you're on a ketogenic diet or a low carb diet, low blood sugar is not, it's kind of a misnomer, because if you feel fine, your blood sugar's not low, it doesn't matter. Where this kind of starts to matter is for type 1 diabetes. And a lot is not known. I have to emphasize that right here. A lot of this is sort of uncharted territory because we don't have a lot of data on people with type 1 diabetes doing ketogenic or low carb diets. I heard a talk by a researcher named Andrew Koutnik, Koutnik, out of the University of South Florida. I think he's one of Dom D'Agostino's students, so this is like a serious researcher. He has type 1 diabetes, and he's on a low carb diet. Doing massively better, much more even blood sugar, much lower doses of insulin needed. Of course, to be clear, people with type 1 diabetes, even on a low carb diet, they will always need exogenous insulin. It's not like type 2 where you can stop taking it altogether. Type 1 will always need insulin, even on a keto diet. However, they can usually dramatically reduce the dose. They can use much less. That being said, the concern for a type 1 diabetic with a low blood sugar is that it's something called asymptomatic hypoglycemia. Asymptomatic meaning you don't have signs and symptoms. You don't get that shaky, ragey anger. The concern, I think, is that this might happen while you're asleep, while you're behind the wheel of a car, while you're, skydiving, while you're doing something that you might not want to have a dangerous, life-threatening situation in the middle of. And the part that's not known is, what is asymptomatic hypoglycemia? Because the whole thing is asymptomatic. If you're not symptomatic, you're probably fine. You probably have enough ketones fueling the brain and the central nervous system. Not ketoacidosis, let's be clear, not ketoacidosis, but a totally safe, helpful, benign level of blood ketones. But we don't know. And this, Andrew Kutnick brought this up. I think this was the point he was hammering home. There's a lot that we don't know, and it might not be safe for a type 1 diabetic to have a blood sugar in the 40s or 50s. We don't know. I personally think if you're not symptomatic and you're on a ketogenic diet, it's probably fine, but again, we don't know. So if you have type 1 diabetes, do what you're comfortable with. I know some people with type 1 diabetes that eat, on a low carb or keto diet who prefer to let their blood sugar run slightly high, not high, but higher than it could be if they were super strict keto, just in case of this low blood sugar thing. There's even some, I think Andrew mentioned this in his talk, but I'm not sure. And by the way, this talk was at the Metabolic Health Summit that was in Los Angeles this February. There'll be another one same time next year, February 2020, in Los Angeles. Kind of like all the world's top researchers are there. I did not present. I'm not that good yet. I just was attending. But he gave this talk, and if I remember right, he mentioned that if his blood sugar reaches a certain point on the low end, he'll actually take like a glucose tab or some type of, they have for diabetes these like pure glucose things, solutions, or mostly tablets, to raise it up just a little bit. Not a ton. He's not looking for like a 50-point rise, but like, 10, 15 points. He just prefers to stay in a safer zone. He feels better that way. Totally cool. Please do what you feel comfortable with. Do what your doctor says is safe for you. Hopefully your doctor's keto friendly and they're not saying that, you type 1 and type 2 diabetics should eat pasta and lots of grains, but that is neither here nor there. We just don't know. We don't know what this means for a type 1 diabetic. Be careful is all I can say. Work with your doctor, monitor your blood sugar. The other thing in a type 2 diabetic, let's talk about type 2 now, especially if you're taking insulin. Let me see my notes here, what I wrote. Okay. People with type 2 diabetes, right? We diagnose type 2 diabetes based on high blood sugar, right? It's always high. Nobody's looking for a blood sugar of 79 to diagnose type 2 diabetes. However, once you're diagnosed, and especially if you are using insulin injections, you could very well have a hypo event. You could have hypoglycemia. And if you're not on a low carb diet and you don't have ketones fueling the brain, then it's very common actually to have a hypo, because you could inject a little too much compared to what you're eating, or the timing could be wrong. When you use insulin injections, not only do you have to adjust the dose based on the composition of your meal, but you have to dose it on timing. Let's say you could take maybe you are at a restaurant and you think you're going to eat in 10 minutes, but there's some kind of crisis in the kitchen and the waiter doesn't bring your food for another 30 minutes, but you injected your insulin. Your body's expecting carbohydrate, and what happens when it doesn't come? Now your blood sugar is tanking and you're getting the hypoglycemia. So I don't envy anybody that's on insulin. I don't envy it at all. If you're a type 2 diabetic, do everything you can to get off those injections. If you're type 1, do everything you can to reduce your dose, which is a low carb diet. Do everything you can to minimize the amount that you're using. As you know, Dr. Richard Bernstein calls that the law of small numbers. The less insulin you require, and of course you always require some, but the less you require, the less margin there is for those wild ups and downs. It's just going to be a little easier to manage the less you have to use. So with type 2 diabetes, you are using insulin to medicate your carbohydrate intake, period. I will repeat that. If you have type 2 diabetes and you're on insulin and you're on a high carb diet, you are using insulin to medicate your diet. So change your diet. And here's the thing. If you adopt a low carb diet, I did a video on keto and medication. So if you're on insulin or you're on any diabetes drugs, really, please watch that video, keto and medication, because When you change your diet very dramatically, like if you do it overnight, you rip the Band-Aid off real quick, and all of a sudden one day you're going to go from your typical, industrialized world, very high carb diet to a low carb or ketogenic diet, you must work with your physician to understand how to adjust your medication safely. There's a paper by Eric Westman and I think Justin Tant, maybe Emily McGuire, a couple of other co-authors, where they mention that in some people who are on insulin for type 2, upon adopting a ketogenic diet, they have to either cut insulin in half or totally discontinue it on the first day. Because if you're medicating your carbohydrate intake and all of a sudden you have very, very little, almost zero carbohydrate intake now, if you inject that same dose of insulin, you're going to be in massive trouble. Again, I'm not providing any advice. I'm not telling you what to do. Work with your physician or your PA or your nurse practitioner or whoever is your licensed medical professional that can help you decrease the dose as needed safely. Unfortunately, not everyone knows how to do this. I'm going to do another video very soon on working with doctors that are non-keto friendly or how to find a keto friendly doctor. There are some places online where you can do this. healclinics.com, heal, H-E-A-L, clinics.com. You can find some doctors there who can help you do this. So if you don't do that, you could have hypoglycemia with type 2. Check one more time. There's less of a chance of that overt, very dangerous hypoglycemia happening from oral diabetes meds, like from pills, especially metformin. There might be some other ones, though, that still can induce some of those effects. So always be careful, no matter what you're taking. I guess that's it for now. Just know that hypoglycemia might not be what we think it is. And if somebody if you're watching my video, you're probably already doing a low carb or ketogenic diet. But if you have a loved one or a friend who has hypoglycemia, they can totally do a low carb diet. In fact, they probably should do a low carb diet. They might have been advised by a medical or nutrition professional who doesn't know any better that because they have hypoglycemia, they should be on a high carb diet, right? Well, we want to make sure to keep your blood sugar up. We don't want you to get those low blood sugars. That's crazy, right? It's crazy because the reason their blood sugar is going so low is because of the high carb. Like if they're eating carbs, their body may be overproducing insulin. They're so sensitive to the carbs, especially refined carbs, like maybe not things like sweet potatoes or even white potatoes or parsnips and carrots and beets, but things like sugary soda, things like, actual white table sugar, donuts, pastries, cookies, that type of stuff. They might be so sensitive to that the body, here's the blood sugar, the body's jamming out so much insulin that now here's what happens to the blood sugar. Like because the insulin is overcorrecting, like instead of returning to normal, the blood sugar is going low. It's tanking massively. That's the hypoglycemia. It's not because they needed more carbs, it's because they ate too many carbs or too many of the wrong kinds of carbs for their constitution. So people it's actually called reactive hypoglycemia, right? Because you're reacting to the carbs you ate. I think a lot of people with hypoglycemia don't need strict keto. They can do a ketogenic diet if they want, but a lot of those people will actually do okay with something like paleo, where they're not eating grains and breads and overt crappy sugars. I may recommend somebody like that might not want to load up on fruit, especially things like grapes and apples. Berries and melon and stone fruits are probably better, but the point is even just getting rid of the majority of the really crappy refined carbs helps a lot of people with hypoglycemia. They don't have to be super strict keto. I'm rambling enough, 24 minutes, I'm done. If you like these videos, if you find them helpful, please subscribe. You can read my blog at tuitnutrition.com, T-U-I-T nutrition.com. I guess thinking if you have ideas for videos you'd like me to do, topics you'd like me to cover, please send me an email to nutrition@gmail.com. You can leave it in the comments, but I cannot guarantee you that I'll see it. If you really want me to cover something, get in touch with me personally directly by email. Thanks for watching, everybody. See you next time.